In a city where emotions are currency and memories can be stolen, Cale Vaughn's clinic thrums with life as he unlocks its door and steps into the dimly lit, condensation-shrouded space. He's a master memory dealer, but his latest acquisition could change everything. A single origin blank engram, untainted by provenance or degradation, holds the key to genuine human feelings in a world of counterfeit emotions. With its power at his fingertips, Cao's life and livelihood are about to be turned upside down. Like and subscribe for more stories like this one. The wet air clung to my skin like a damp rag as I unlocked a clinic door, pushing inside with my shoulder. The cheap glass panes fogged over from the perpetual condensation. It was like stepping into a steam room. I'd inherited this dank little office from Doss when he disappeared, gone in an instant, leaving behind nothing but an unpaid loan to a tier loan shark and his best friend's betrayal. They said he died in the undertier, another statistic lost in the grime and shadows. This wasn't my dream, trading memories like goods on a market stall for scraps of credits that barely paid rent. But it was better than dying in a gutter, and I'd survived this long by being the best at what I did, extracting emotions with surgical precision and selling them off to those desperate enough to buy back pieces of their stolen lives. Tonight's client, a grayed-out widow, waited for me at my workstation, her eyes dry as husks beneath sunken lids. She'd paid top-tier credits for an engram of her dead husband's laugh, but I knew the truth. It was third generation now, degraded and hissing like an old crackle box. Still, she trusted me to deliver something, anything, that might ease the numbness in her chest. I set my toolkit down with a clatter, wiping my hands on a greasy rag before turning to face her. "All right," I said, voice rough as the city streets, "let's get this done." She handed over the credits and leaned back into the worn vinyl chair while I prepped the neural dock. Cold metal and sterile gel, meant for surgical precision rather than the sloppy mess I usually worked with. As a licensed memory dealer, I wasn't supposed to touch raw emotions, but desperate times called for desperate measures. "Here we go," I muttered, sliding the engram into place. The widow's eyes fluttered shut as I activated the dock, her heartbeat slowing until it was little more than a distant echo. This close, I could smell the mildew and solder from my workbench, an odor as much a part of me as the calluses on my palms. I watched her chest flatten, the life draining out in real time, replaced by the purchased memory of her dead husband's laugh. She'd replay it now, feel that warmth again, even if only for a few precious moments before it faded back to gray. And I'd take what was left, a fragment of happiness she couldn't afford to keep. The transaction complete, I ejected the engram and wiped down my workstation. The widow's eyes opened, glassy but no longer vacant, a flicker of joy restored to her face. She left with a lighter step, a glimmer of warmth in her eyes, something she'd paid top credits for, even if it wouldn't last. As I locked up the clinic and stepped out into the undertier's dimly lit alleys, the city seemed to swallow me whole again. I spat on the ground, a reflexive gesture against the grime, against the world that had ground me down until I was just another grayed-out soul, trading in memories like currency. But then why did the thought of Mira's face, her laughter, her warmth, still linger in my mind, unbidden and achingly real? I shook off the phantom memory as I hailed a rideshare, climbing into the back seat to let the engine roar away from the undertier's confines. In another life, perhaps, I might have yearned for something more than this endless cycle of extraction and sale. But here, in the Viridian tier, emotions were a luxury only the rich could afford, and I was nothing if not pragmatic. The rideshare took me deeper into the city's bowels, past licensed spires that pierced the smog-choked sky like needles from hell, until finally we reached my destination, Doss's place. It was a run-down hovel in a dead-end alley, but he'd made it his own, cramming every inch with gadgets and gizmos pilfered from his various scams. As I entered, the door slammed shut behind me, Always good to keep the under-tier at bay. And Doss appeared out of nowhere, his eyes wild as he thrust a small data chip into my hands. "Kale, you're not going to believe what I found," he whispered, voice trembling with excitement. "This is it, the find of the century." My gut clenched, a familiar sensation, one that always preceded a disaster. But Doss's enthusiasm was infectious. "What is it?" I asked, flipping the chip over in my hand. "An origin blank," he said, his grin wide as a shark's. "The curator has them. Flawless copies of raw emotions. No provenance chain, zero generational hiss. It's impossible." I frowned, trying to process what he was saying. Origin blanks were supposed to be the holy grail for memory dealers like me, but they were also illegal as hell. A single origin blank could expose us all and lead to mandatory grey-out of our affect ledgers. "Where did you get this?" I demanded, holding out my hand for him to take back the chip. "You can't be serious." Doss hesitated, his smile faltering. "I am, and I got it from a contact with the curator. They're willing to sell them, but only in batches of 5. I just need someone to verify and fence them." My mind raced as I tried to weigh the risks against any potential reward. "Let me see it," I finally said, reaching out for the chip. Doss handed it over reluctantly, and I examined it under the clinic's dim lighting. The device itself looked standard enough, but when I keyed into its metadata, my jaw dropped. Not only was there no provenance chain, but the generational hiss that usually accompanied any decent engram was absent entirely. "How did you even get your hands on this?" I asked, more to myself than Doss, who had been watching me with an expectant grin. An origin blank was the ultimate forbidden fruit. A single one could topple the entire affect economy and land every memory dealer in deep shit. "It's from the curator," he said proudly. "They have access to all sorts of illicit goods, but these are something else entirely." My mind churned as I tried to imagine how the curator had managed this feat, forging emotions so convincingly they passed for real. It defied everything I knew about engram generation. And yet here it was, a perfect, lossless copy of raw human feeling. "Doss," I said slowly, "you need to take this back and tell your curator contact we're not interested." The look on his face told me he wasn't going to listen. "Fine, I'd have to get creative. You know how hot this chip is?" I said, trying to sound casual despite the panic rising in my chest. "It's like holding a live grenade. If Vague gets wind of it." Doss's grin faltered for a moment before he shrugged. "So what? We fence it through some back channels and take our cut." "We could lose everything," I hissed, grabbing his arm to make him listen. "Every legal engram in the tier is tied to an originator, even the cheap ones. But if this thing leaks into the licit market, people will want origin blanks over licensed stuff any day of the week." The implications were staggering. A flood of counterfeit emotions that would decimate the affect economy and probably bring down every memory dealer in the process. Doss stared at me, his eyes narrowing. "You're scared," he said quietly. "Fuck yes I am," I snapped back. "I should be terrified you brought this abomination into my shop." But even as I said it, something inside me was intrigued, curious. "In years, yeah, or we could end up audited out of existence," I shot back. But as Doss left the clinic and disappeared into the under-tier's damp labyrinth, I found myself staring at the case he'd left on my counter. The origin blank seemed to hum with an energy all its own, like a promise of something forbidden and exhilarating. And what was the harm in just trying it out? For curiosity's sake, with a heavy sigh, I picked up the chip and headed for my private dock, wondering how much of my soul I was willing to sell for one more hit of genuine human feeling. The dock hummed as I prepared it, and when I finally keyed into the origin blank's metadata, a flood of sensory impressions washed over me. Warm sunlight on skin, the smell of freshly brewed coffee, the sound of a soft, intimate voice. "Good morning," Mira said, her words dripping with affection. And suddenly, I was there, standing in an unfamiliar kitchen, surrounded by the hum of daily life. The memory played like a movie, unfolding scene after scene: breakfast on the couch, a walk through a park, laughter and argument and quiet moments of tenderness. I felt it, that elusive sense of connection, of belonging to something greater than myself. It was intoxicating, this counterfeit warmth spreading through my chest. And when Mira's voice whispered "love" in my ear, I knew I was in trouble. Not just because the engram would cost me a small fortune to run, but because it had awakened something inside me that I'd thought long dead, a feeling, a real one, not manufactured by corporate R&D or harvested from the misery of others. And now I couldn't stop thinking about her, about Mira and the life they'd shared, however briefly, in this perfect counterfeit bubble. The memory was like a drug, more potent than anything I'd ever sold on the black market. So much for my resolve to turn it back over to DOS. This origin blank had me hook, line, and sinker. With a deep breath, I keyed out of the dock and looked around at the dingy clinic, feeling like I was seeing it all through new eyes, Mira's eyes. And when my ledger pinged with an unlicensed emotion flag, I couldn't even bring myself to care. The origin blink had found its first victim. I'd be back for more. It was only a matter of time. The clinic hummed with life as it always did, but my attention wasn't on the clients or the transactions anymore. It was focused inward, on the chip nestled in my pocket and the woman whose memories now lived inside me. "DOS," I said, interrupting his rambling tale of how he'd scored this perfect origin blank from some back-alley curator. "I need you to run a check." He raised an eyebrow. "What kind?" "A signature analysis." I pulled out the chip and handed it over. "See if we can trace her back to the source. Can trace this thing back to its source, preferably without getting us both nailed for illegal ledger access." DOS nodded, flipping the chip in his hand as he worked through the connection protocols on his slate. Sweat beaded on my brow while I waited. Sweat born of anticipation and fear, not just the humid air conditioning. "It's clean," DOS said finally. "No provenance chain, no generational hiss. This thing is an anomaly." "Not necessarily," I countered, already thinking 2 steps ahead. "It might have been pirated off a legitimate ledger. If that was the case, it could still be traced back to its origin. And even if not, well, there were ways to find out what made this engram so perfect." "You think we should sell it?" DOS asked, his eyes sparking with greed. I hesitated. Part of me wanted to unload it quickly and wash my hands of the whole affair. But another part, a newer, more treacherous part I hadn't even known existed until Mira's memories invaded my mind, craved to keep this origin blank for myself, to run it again and again, basking in its warmth. "No," I said decisively, "not yet." DOS frowned. "What do you mean?" "It could be our ticket out of this under-tier shit. We can fence it to the highest bidder and finally live like real people." Real people with feelings, he meant. But I couldn't shake the suspicion that Mira's memories were more than just a product to trade. "We'll keep it quiet for now," I said firmly. "I want to learn more about this origin blank before we start flashing it around." And before my curiosity got the best of me, and I docked myself again, losing track of time in Mira's counterfeit world, just then the clinic door swung open and a woman stepped inside. She wore the uniform of an auditor, slate gray with silver accents, her badge pinned to the breast pocket. Her eyes were hard as she scanned the room, settling on me. "Cale Vaughn," she said, her voice crisp and commanding. "I'm Auditor Vey. We've been monitoring your transactions, and I have reason to believe you're in possession of an origin blank." My heart skipped a beat. So much for keeping it under wraps. But before I could respond, DOS jumped up from his stool. "Hey now, that's not." Auditor Vey cut him off with a raised hand. "Ren DOS, you're on my list of known origin blank handlers. You're coming with me." DOS sputtered but complied, following Vey out the door without another word to me. I watched them go, feeling the weight of the origin blank in my pocket like a time bomb. I had 48 hours before Auditor Vey would be back for her pound of flesh, or rather, my origin blank and testimony against whoever was peddling these counterfeit memories on the black market. And as the clinic door closed behind them, I knew exactly what I needed to do. I fumbled, with the origin blank chip in my pocket, my mind racing. The auditor knew about it. She was going to take it no matter what I did. But if she got her hands on me, I'd be grayed out for good. My only option was to use the information DOS had given me. I pulled out a small console from under the counter and began hacking into the black market networks, tracking down leads on who sold this origin blank in the first place. The curator's name kept surfacing, but with no contact info or location. Whoever they were, they seemed to be one step ahead of everyone else. I glanced at the docked neural interface, wondering if I could get a glimpse of Mira again before things went south. Just for a moment, I clicked it on and plunged into her memory. Sunlight streamed through the window as we sat together in silence. The scar above her wrist caught my eye, an old injury or a birthmark. She was looking at a photograph, her lips parted with a soft smile that made my chest ache. The picture showed two women standing side by side, one older, one younger. I recognized Mira's eyes and hairline in the older woman, but not the rest of her features. "Mira?" I asked softly, my voice breaking through the memory. "Who's that?" She looked up at me, startled. "Oh, it's just Lila," she said, holding out the picture. "My mom." I stared at the image, a jolt of recognition running down my spine. That woman, her eyes and hairline were unmistakably Mira's, but the rest was different, much older. The photo had been taken years ago. Suddenly, it clicked into place. This wasn't just any memory. It was real life. Mira's past, before whatever happened to make her a prototype for corporate grief engineering, and she'd shared it with me, willingly, lovingly, as if I were part of that reality too. The connection snapped me back to the present. Auditor Vey would never let me keep this. My origin blank would be seized along with my testimony, and Mira's life story with her. But for now, I had one chance left to use it. With trembling fingers, I pulled up the contact info of every black market operator I'd managed to trace, including DOS's supposed curator connection. I sent out a message in code, "I'm clean," and attached an encrypted file containing the only truth Mira knew, her life before she was reduced to synthetic code. If there was anyone who could help me, it was them. And if not, then at least they'd know what had happened to their product prototype before the author took everything away. I hit send, holding my breath for a reply. The seconds ticked by like hours as I waited for confirmation that my message had reached its intended recipients. If they showed up before they replied or acted on my transmission, but maybe, just maybe, someone would care enough to help me keep Mira real, even if it was only for the time I had left. I glanced at the docked neural interface, hesitating over whether to take one last look at her life. My fingers hovered over the controls as the clinic door rattled open again, announcing Auditor Vey's return with DOS in tow. This was it. Time was up, and I knew exactly what I had to do. Auditor Vey stood in the doorway, flanked by two enforcers whose faces were as grayed out as Kale's own. Her eyes flicked over the clinic, taking stock of equipment and supplies before landing back on him. "You have exactly 48 hours, she said, her voice a cold slate. "After that, your ledger will be reconciled to 0. All unlicensed emotion, including any origin blank contagion you may be harboring, will be permanently grayed out." Kale stared at her, frozen. The weight of the chip in his pocket felt like a lead brick against his thigh. "You're not listening," he said, trying to keep his voice steady. "The origin blank isn't just some random memory. It's a whole life, years, decades, people, and I have proof it was manufactured by your own corporation." Vey smiled, but it didn't reach her eyes. "You'd be surprised what we can manufacture," she said. "And you'd be even more surprised to learn what you're holding on to right now." Her gaze drifted to the docked interface where Mira's life still played in a loop. She turned back to KL. "We can help you reconcile this contamination from within," Vey continued. "You'll have your emotions back, or at least as much of them as you can afford. But if you insist on holding on to illegal emotion..." She trailed off, letting the threat hang in the air. The enforcers shifted, their hands resting on the neural disruptors holstered at their sides. "You'll become an example," Vey said. Kale's mind raced as he weighed his options. He could surrender Mira now, in exchange for a life of emotional numbness, or he could gamble on keeping her and risk everything. "Give me 1 hour," he said finally, buying himself time to think. Vey raised an eyebrow but nodded. 1 hour. After that, we start the reconciliation process. As soon as she left with her enforcers, Kel yanked out the origin blank chip and stared at it, his heart racing in his chest. He knew what he had to do. He docked into Mira's life one last time, and this time he let himself feel every moment, every emotion. The warmth of their apartment on a sunny day, the softness of her hand in his as they walked through the park, the taste of coffee together on Saturday mornings. For an hour, he allowed himself to believe she was real. When the timer finally went off and he surfaced with a gasp, it felt like losing a piece of himself. But he wasn't done yet. He pulled out the fragment chip, his own original memory, and docked into that instead. He'd copied Mira's life from it once before, but now he wanted to know more about what had been real. As he slipped into the sunlit Tuesday with her by his side, he recognized himself in the reflection behind them. Younger, happier, with hair that wasn't yet grayed out. And for a moment, he forgot everything else. Then the memory loop ended and Cale surfaced again, blinking in the dim clinic light. His heart still raced, but it was no longer from fear of Vey's wrath or the thrill of Mira's counterfeit warmth. It was because he'd remembered something else. Something real that had nothing to do with her. Something that made him want to weep. The last time Cale had seen his brother alive, Doss had been sitting in their favorite dive bar, nursing a whiskey and looking like the world had beaten him down. He'd smiled when Cale walked up, the first time he'd cracked a genuine smile in months, and said, "You know what I wish for?" "What's that?" "A chance to be happy again." Cale had never replied. He hadn't known how, and now it was too late. As the clinic door swung open once more, he didn't look up this time. All he cared about seeing was Doss, and whether his brother would still have a face by the end of their conversation. "You're in deep shit, Cale," Doss said from the doorway, his voice a jumble of desperation and bravado as he leaned against the frame like it might hold him up. "Auditor Vey's been sniffing around. Flagged your ledger for too much unlicensed joy." He paused, glancing over his shoulder with a paranoid twitch of the eye. "Fuckers are after origin blanks again. Heard rumors they'll reconcile anyone who's got one. Gray out, total wipe." Cal's grip tightened on the counter where he'd been repairing another client's dock. The chill metal seeped into his palm as unease wormed through him. But Doss always exaggerated. "What are you talking about?" He forced a laugh, trying to keep it light. "You know I don't deal in origin blanks." Doss pushed off the doorframe and sauntered over, his movements loose-limbed as ever, but for a hint of underlying tension that made Cale's instincts sit up. The man had always been full of wild stories and empty promises. Now something felt different, more real and far scarier. "What are you selling me today?" Cale asked flatly, not really wanting to know. Doss slapped an envelope onto the counter with a smack that echoed through the clinic's dank air. "I got it from the curator himself. An origin blank so pure it'll make your head spin." His grin was lopsided and too wide, the kind of smile you'd wear when you were lying to someone you cared about. Cale's gut twisted with a mix of dread and morbid curiosity. How could anyone possibly have an origin blank? And yet, he picked up the envelope, his fingers tracing the worn seam. Inside would be proof that everything Cale knew about memory dealing was wrong, that there existed feelings as pure and untainted as the ones people used to sell their souls for. "What's it cost?" he asked through gritted teeth, already knowing how much trouble this could land him in. The curator didn't deal in cheap merchandise. "Fuck the price," Doss said with a laugh that was too shrill. "I bought this one cheap off-ledger, one-time thing." Cale frowned, his mind racing to piece together what this might mean for his business and himself. Doss was always skimming off the top. If he'd managed to score an origin blank at such a steal, it meant the curator had something new in stock, something with serious implications. He pulled out the chip from its envelope, his fingers trembling as he turned it over. It looked cleaner than any engram Cale had ever dealt. No signs of hiss or degradation to be found on its surface, and when he ran a diagnostic scan, the provenance chain was blank. Zero generational loss. This wasn't just an origin blank. This was the fucking holy grail. So, what's it worth? He asked again, his voice low and dangerous. Doss hesitated, his eyes darting toward the clinic door as if he expected Vay to burst in any moment with a warrant. "I'll fence it for top dollar," he said finally, voice tight with desperation. "Enough to clear my debt, and maybe even give me a little cushion so I don't get squeezed by the auditors." Cale's gaze narrowed on his brother's face. There was something new about Doss now, a look of outright panic lurking beneath the bravado. He knew that expression, had worn it himself more times than he cared to admit in these last few years, the look of a man drowning in debt and unable to surface. "What have you gotten yourself into?" Cale asked quietly. Doss's grin faltered for an instant before he recovered it with a forced laugh. "Oh, fuck it, bro. Just take the fucking chip and give me your verdict. I don't got time for this." Cale hesitated, his mind torn between the profit potential of selling this origin blank on the black market and the risk it posed to his own ledger stability if Vay's rumors were true about the auditor's stance on such merchandise. He looked up at Doss again, noting the dark circles under his brother's eyes, the weariness in his posture. The air between them seemed to thicken with unspoken words and bitter history. Thinning hair, the lines of strain etched into that loud mouth. And then he remembered something. A moment from years ago when they'd both been young and stupid enough to believe money could fix everything. They'd pooled their meager savings for a single night out at an upscale dive bar, trying to live large if only for one evening. Doss had gotten drunk off his ass, Cale still sober as ever. They'd ended up in some dive's back alley, Doss vomiting between hiccups and Cale trying to talk him down from the ledge of despair, promising everything would be okay, that they could scrape by, survive this shithole city together no matter what. And then he'd looked at his brother, really looked, past the bravado and the loudness, and seen a man who was just as lost and scared and grayed out as everyone else in this fucking tier. A man who would do anything to keep from drowning. Cale reached across the counter and snagged Doss by the collar of his stained coat. "Listen," he said, voice low and fierce. "If you're into something deep with the curator, if you've gotten yourself tangled up in shit that's gonna land us both in audit's crosshairs, then we need to cut our losses and get out." Doss flinched, as if Cale had physically struck him, but he didn't pull away. Instead, he let his head drop forward. Cale's grip tightened on Doss's coat. The fabric was damp with vomit, reeking of cheap booze and stale cigarettes. "What did you do?" Cale demanded, his voice a low growl that sent shivers down Doss's spine. Doss swallowed hard, trying to find some semblance of composure amidst the hangover-induced haze clouding his mind. He forced himself to meet Cale's gaze, those damned eyes that saw right through him like a fucking X-ray machine. "I didn't do anything," he protested weakly, but it rang hollow even to his own ears. Cale's grip relaxed just enough for Doss to pull away, albeit only an inch or two. "Then what the fuck are you holding on to?" Cale spat, disgust evident in every word. "I found a chip." Doss mumbled, eyes darting about as if searching for escape routes. "A fucking gold mine of an engram, flawless, pristine, like nothing I've ever seen before." Cale's face contorted into a mix of disbelief and outright horror. "You're fucking kidding me," he growled. "No, I'm not," Doss snapped back defensively. "I scored it cheap off the curator, said it was hot as hell, but no one knew what it was or where it came from, just that it was pure gold on the black market." Cale's expression turned cold and calculating, all traces of warmth extinguished like a snuffed candle flame. "The curator didn't know what it was?" he repeated slowly, each word dripping with suspicion. "No." Doss hesitated, then blurted out, "But I do. Or at least I think so." "What are you?" Kyle demanded, his tone biting and impatient. I don't know how to explain," Doss stammered, reaching into his pocket. He pulled out a data strip, holding it out like an offering to the gods of commerce. On it was etched the symbol for origin blank, and Cale's eyes nearly bulged out of their sockets. "What the fuck?" he hissed, snatching the strip from Doss's trembling fingers. Doss watched in silence as Cal studied the data with a mixture of incredulity and growing dread. The air seemed to thicken around them, heavy with unspoken truths and impending doom. "You sold copies of this fucking thing? Already?" Doss nodded weakly, his throat constricting as he swallowed hard against the rising tide of panic. "Yeah, I needed the money. Had to pay off a loan shark before he busted my kneecaps." Cale's expression darkened further, and for an instant Doss swore he saw something akin to murderous intent flash across those cold gray eyes, but it vanished just as quickly. "You idiot!" Cale snapped, slamming his fist onto the counter. The cheap glass shook ominously. "Now we're both fucked." Doss flinched at the impact, the vibration traveling up his arm and into his chest like a jolt of electricity. "I know," he whispered, eyes downcast in shame and despair, knowing full well Cale would never forgive him for this. He'd lost his brother before. This was just another nail in that coffin. And then the unthinkable happened. Cale reached out and grabbed Doss by the collar again, but this time it wasn't to shake or threaten. Instead, he yanked Doss close, their faces mere inches apart, as Cale's voice dropped to a hoarse whisper. "We're going to get through this, you hear me? We'll find a way, together." Doss blinked, taken aback by the sudden display of brotherly solidarity. For an instant, he felt a warmth spreading through his chest that had nothing to do with cheap liquor or desperation, and everything to do with Cale. "Yeah," Doss managed to choke out, voice cracking with emotion he'd long thought dead and buried. Together, they stood there like that for a few long moments, two lost souls clinging to each other in the face of an uncertain future. And then Cale pushed Doss back, his grip releasing just as abruptly as it had tightened. "Go," he growled, voice returning to its usual hard-boiled timbre. "Clean yourself up and lay low for a while. I'll handle things here." Doss nodded, still reeling from the unexpected display of camaraderie, though he knew better than to mistake kindness for weakness. They both lived in a city where only the strong survived, and right now they were two broken men clinging to each other like life rafts in a storm. "Thanks," Doss said softly before turning and shuffling out into the night, leaving Cale alone with his thoughts and the ominous weight of that origin blank chip on his conscience. Cale stared down at the origin blank, its smooth surface reflecting back nothing but darkness. His hand tightened around it, knuckles white with a mix of anticipation and dread. Everything Doss had said echoed through his mind. The curator's confession, Mira's synthetic origin, the fact that she was built from pieces of real people's memories, including his own. He couldn't shake off the feeling that by holding on to this chip, he was condemning himself to a fate worse than gray out. The corporate render program was a ticking time bomb, and he'd just become its human detonator. And yet, with a deep breath, Cale reached for the neural dock again. He needed answers, and Mira was the only lead left in this twisted game of cat and mouse. As soon as the dock connected to his brain, he dove back into the memory. This time, instead of wallowing in the warmth of her presence, he focused on the seams, the cracks where synthetic and real intersected. His mind raced through countless iterations, each one a different angle or depth of exploration. And then he found it, the telltale sign that something was off, that Mira wasn't quite human. Not just any scar, but the same crescent-shaped mark he remembered from his childhood apartment. Cale's heart pounded as realization dawned. The corp had harvested fragments of real memories for Mira's prototype, including his own past. But which one? There were countless scars on his body, each with its own story. He pulled out of the dock and ran a hand through his hair, trying to calm down. He needed proof, concrete evidence that this scar belonged to him. Without it, they would never believe him. As he pondered his next move, a soft knock sounded at the door. Cale tensed, wondering if Doss had returned with more bad news, or if Faye had tracked him down despite his efforts to lay low. "Who is it?" he called out, his voice sharper than intended. "It's me," came the familiar rasp of his brother's voice. "I need to talk to you." Cale swore under his breath. He hadn't expected Doss back so soon, or at all for that matter. But after what had happened earlier tonight, he couldn't deny the man any chance to redeem himself. He unlocked the door and let Doss in, eyeing him warily as the other man stumbled into the room, clearly worse for wear. "What's going on?" Cale asked, trying to keep his tone neutral. "And don't tell me you've sold me out again." Doss shook his head vigorously, a haunted look in his eyes. "No, no, I." Cale raised an eyebrow, but remained silent, waiting for Doss to continue. "I found something out," the other man said, swallowing hard before spitting out his revelation in a rush of words. "I traced Vey's movements tonight. I know where she took me from, where she interrogated me." Cale stared at him, assessing the man's resolve in that moment. He could see the depth of his brother's commitment to their cause, not just for Cale himself, but for Mira, for their shared history, and for the idea of rebellion against an oppressive system. In the end, it was a decision point as much about loyalty as it was about survival. And as he looked at Doss, battered and bruised but unbroken, Cale knew which path he would choose. "All right," he said finally, his voice firm with determination. "Let's do this." The night air clung to their skin like a damp blanket as they stole through the labyrinthine alleys of the undertier, hugging shadows in an effort to blend with the darkness. Cale couldn't help but think it was a fitting metaphor for the state of their lives, lost and shrouded by the very things that were supposed to illuminate them. Their footsteps echoed off the crumbling brick walls as they navigated toward Doss's hideout, a run-down tenement on the edge of the district. Cale couldn't shake the feeling that Vey was closing in, her presence like an invisible net tightening around them with every passing moment. "I hope you know what you're getting us into," he muttered to his brother as they reached the rickety stairs leading up to their destination. Doss shot him a defiant look but didn't respond, his eyes fixed on the darkened doorway ahead. They slipped inside, finding themselves in a cramped room filled with the detritus of countless deals gone bad. Stacks of memory chips, scattered tools of the trade, and an assortment of half-eaten meals left to rot. Cale wrinkled his nose at the pungent stench hanging in the air as Doss moved toward a makeshift workstation shoved against one wall. "I've been working on something," Doss said, fiddling with the collection of wires and chips laid out before him. "Something that might just get us off the corp's radar." Cale watched intently as his brother began to assemble what appeared to be an elaborate data transmitter, a device capable of sending encrypted messages across the tier in mere seconds. It was a risky proposition, one that could bring swift retribution if discovered. But Cale knew they had no other choice. "Who's your contact?" he asked, glancing around the room for any sign of another player in this high-stakes game. "And how do you plan on getting us out of here?" Doss hesitated before answering, his gaze flicking toward the doorway, as if sensing an unseen presence lurking just beyond. "I've got a guy," he said finally, his voice barely above a whisper. "A black market hacker who owes me a favor, or at least he would if he knew what I was really asking." Cale raised an eyebrow, intrigued despite himself. And he can get us to the outer rim of the tier without anyone knowing our business," Doss said, his hands moving with practiced ease as he connected the final wires on the transmitter. "From there, we make our own way off the grid. Find a place where feelings aren't currency and memories don't have to be stolen." It sounded like a dream, one that Cale had long since abandoned to the bleak realities of his existence. But for Doss's sake, he was willing to grasp at it, even if it meant giving up everything they'd built here in the undertier. "Let's do this," he said again, a spark of determination igniting within him. "Get us out of here and start rebuilding our lives." Doss nodded once, his eyes locked on Cale with an unspoken promise. Then he reached for the transmitter, his fingers dancing across the keys as he typed out a message to their mysterious contact. Seconds ticked by in agonizing slowness as they waited for a response, every nerve in Cale's body tensed and ready to flee at the first sign of trouble. But when it finally came, there was no warning. Just the soft hum of the transmitter signaling that their escape plan was set in motion. With a deep breath, Doss pocketed the device and turned toward Cale with a grim smile. "Time to get out of Dodge," he said, his voice steady despite the urgency coursing through them both. "Let's move." Doss led them through the narrow, dimly lit alleyways of the undertier, keeping to the shadows as they moved swiftly but quietly towards their rendezvous point. The air was thick with the stench of rotting refuse and burned wiring, a constant reminder of the squalid existence that awaited those who couldn't afford to escape it. As they walked, Cale's mind raced with thoughts of Vey and her relentless pursuit of origin blanks. He knew that their encounter at his clinic had not gone unnoticed. He could almost feel the auditor's eyes upon him, even from this distance. The weight of his own secrets, Mira, Doss's betrayal, the curator's confession, threatened to crush him beneath its oppressive burden. But as they neared their destination, a small, unassuming building tucked away in one of the undertier's most crime-ridden districts, Kyle felt a glimmer of hope ignite within him. This could be their ticket out of this wretched place, a chance for them to start anew and leave their pasts behind. When they finally reached the entrance, Doss paused, his eyes scanning the street with a practiced caution. He nodded once to indicate that all was clear before turning to Cale with a grim expression. "I'll handle this," he said, his voice low and urgent. "Stay back and keep quiet." Cale swallowed hard as he watched Doss disappear into the darkness of the building's entrance. His heart pounded in his chest as he waited for what felt like an eternity before hearing the sound of voices echoing from within. Suddenly, Doss emerged again, a figure at his side whose face was obscured by shadows. They spoke in hushed tones, their words lost to Cale on the wind. But when they finally broke apart and began walking towards him, he could see that it was indeed their contact, the one who had arranged for their escape. As they drew nearer, the figure stepped into a pool of dim light spilling from a nearby doorway, revealing none other than the curator herself. Her features were gaunt and sunken, her eyes gleaming with an unsettling intensity as she locked gazes with Cale and Doss. "It's time," she said simply, her voice devoid of emotion. "You have what you need to leave this place behind." Cale felt his heart lurch in his chest as he stared at the woman before him, the one who had so callously revealed the truth about Mira and their shared past. How could she possibly know anything about helping them escape? "What do you want from us?" he demanded, his voice shaking with anger and confusion. The curator's lips curled into a faint smile as she reached into a coat pocket and withdrew a small data chip. "This," she said, extending it towards Cale, "contains the evidence we need to expose the corporation's synthetic engram scandal." Cale felt a spark of hope ignite within him as he took the chip from her outstretched hand. This could be their ticket to freedom, not just for himself and Doss, but for countless others trapped in this wretched system. "Thank you," he said quietly, his voice laced with gratitude. The curator's smile grew slightly as she regarded him with an almost maternal warmth. "I did what was necessary," she replied. "But remember, I am not your friend." With that enigmatic warning hanging heavy in the air, the curator turned and vanished back into the darkness of her hideout, leaving Cale and Deuce to make their way out of the undertier once and for all. As they emerged onto the main streets, the bright neon lights of the upper tiers blazed like a beacon before them. Cale felt his heart swell with hope as he gazed upon that distant horizon, knowing that whatever lay ahead, he had finally found the courage to take the first steps towards reclaiming their lives and forging a new path forward. Together, hand in hand, they walked into the unknown future, ready to face whatever challenges it might bring. And though the scars of their past would always linger, Cale knew that with Mira's memory locked safely within him, even if only as a fragment of his own soul, he could weather any storm and emerge stronger than ever before. The end. The neon lights of the upper tiers flickered against Cale's face like the pulse of a living thing as he emerged from the undertier with Doss at his side. It felt almost surreal, stepping out into the bright, bustling world after so long in the dank shadows below. He was unaccustomed to the open air and the din of commerce. Everything here seemed loud and urgent compared to the measured rhythms of the undertier. As they made their way towards the licensing spires, Cale couldn't shake the feeling that Vey might be waiting for them. The auditor had promised to expose the corpse synthetic engram scam, but Cale knew how these things worked. She could just as easily decide to keep her mouth shut and take him down instead. He glanced over at Doss, noticing his brother's vacant stare, the grayed-out soul behind those once vibrant eyes. The betrayal still stung. Doss had sold them both out in a moment of desperation, thinking only of saving himself. Cale understood the urge. After all, he'd spent years doing much the same thing, but the cost had become too high to bear. Reaching the licensing spires, they found Vey standing at attention outside her office, flanked by two corp enforcers who looked like they could crush a man's skull between their fingers. Cale felt a chill run down his spine as she approached, her eyes locked on him with an unnerving intensity. "We have a lot to discuss," she said coldly, ignoring Doss entirely. "The corporate board is eager for the details of our findings. I expect you'll cooperate fully." Cale's heart sank. He'd hoped Bay would take his side, but it seemed he was wrong again. As they stepped inside her office, the door clicking shut behind them like a prison cell, Cale realized there was no escaping the consequences of his actions. Vey dropped into a chair and pulled out her comms device with a flicker of annoyance on her face. "We need to make a statement," she said briskly, her tone indicating that further conversation was unnecessary. Cale stood rigid beside Doss as Vey dictated their testimony into the device, every detail of their discovery, from the origin blanks to the corporation's render program. The words felt like poison on his tongue. Telling this story would strip him bare and leave him exposed for all to see. As they finished, Cale glanced over at Doss once more. His brother looked lost, a shell of the man he used to be. He paid the price for their mistakes, and now it was time for Cale to do the same. Taking a deep breath, he turned back to Vey. "We're ready when you are," he said quietly. The auditor raised an eyebrow, clearly expecting him to protest or beg for leniency. But Cale knew better than to plead his case. Not now, not ever again. With Doss's help, he'd uncovered the truth of this world and brought it to light. It was time to accept the consequences and move on. As Vey began broadcasting their testimony across the city, a new chapter in Cale's life began to unfold. He couldn't feel love or joy anymore. Those emotions were gone forever, stolen by the very corporation he'd exposed. But he did have something more valuable now, the truth. Standing there in Vey's office, watching as the world learned of their discovery and the empire built on suffering began to crumble, Cale finally felt a glimmer of peace settle over him. It was bittersweet, but it was enough. The counterfeit memories would fade away soon, replaced by the real thing. The dull ache of having lived through so much darkness. And yet, despite everything, he knew that as long as there were people like Vey and Doss in this world, flawed individuals who still managed to find a shred of decency despite the corruption around them, there was always hope. Always a chance for something better to emerge from the ashes of what had been. As the credits rolled on their testimony, Cale took one last look at his reflection in Vey's office window. The man staring back no longer wore the hardened shell of a memory dealer. He was raw and exposed now, laid bare by the trials he'd faced. But he looked alive. For the first time in years, with Doss by his side, Cale stepped out into the bright, blinding light of a new dawn, ready to face whatever lay ahead. The under-tier might be behind them, but they both knew that the real journey was only just beginning.